1 year ago, the World Health Organization officially announced that the spread of COVID-19 had evolved into an epidemic. Well, today, I'm able to announce that the coronavirus epidemic is even worse. While we have closed down schools, shut down businesses, and introduced social distancing, the United States still ranks #1 with roughly 30 million total cases and 500,000 total deaths according to CNN Health. So, where have we gone wrong as a nation? Inadequate testing facilities, the lack of compliance with social distancing, and the downplaying of the dangers of the virus by our government officials, namely former President Donald Trump, has exacerbated the effects of the virus. And unfortunately, Trump's suggestion of treating the virus with an injection of disinfectant is not viable. Evidently, this problem doesn't just pan out with the coronavirus epidemic, as we treat other issues such as racism with the same mentality. As Americans, during the beginning stages of the pandemic, like we've been long past it, when in reality, we are just getting started, was a large miscalculation. And our desire to move on from issues without addressing them proves problematic. And thanks to the United States' phenomenal education system, we've long equated the end of slavery with the end of racism, as school textbooks erase the history of America's bigotry. From the long history of segregation to the Japanese internment camps briefly touched in history class, the United States has long displayed their desire to move on without addressing its past. Even today, hate crimes against Asian Americans have spiked by 150% following the news of the epidemic, according to NBC News. But despite the constant insistence that this is not what America is about, its history and the brutalization long faced by people of color show that racism is deeply embedded within its identity. So, let's dust off our history books and find out how this way of thinking has spread. Next, we'll take a look at the symptoms of this ideal, and finally, we'll try and look for a cure. Throughout our childhood, the narrative of the American dream has been touted to us. But what dream awaits the Asian American who moved to the United States in the 1850s to pursue this narrative, only to be viewed as perpetually foreign to this day? What dream awaits African Americans who were freed from slavery 150 years ago and yet still fight for their lives? And what dream awaits Middle Eastern immigrants who were so easily branded as terrorists following the event of 9/11? The reality is that racism didn't get better with the end of slavery, the civil rights movement, or even the election of Obama as president. And yet, we often conflate these small victories with racism being solved. Psychologist S.E. Robertson explains that when it comes to problem solving, humans often expect for there to be an end goal to be met. We evaluate and simplify issues so a solution can be selected. This makes it problematic for when we, as humans, try to solve an issue as systemic as racism, which cannot simply be solved through one-off solutions. So we turn to denial. A 2018 poll conducted by The Economist showed that 40% of white Americans believe that Black people would be as successful as whites if they simply tried harder, ignoring the policies like Jim Crow and redlining that create generations of poverty that still affect minorities to this day. And there's a tragedy revealing that America's white supremacy is still alive. Only here, this is not what America is about. But we must acknowledge how America called the Nazis' imprisonment of Jews horrific, while forcing Japanese Americans into internment camps. We must acknowledge how America deployed the military during Black Lives Matter protests, and yet none at the raiding of the White House by rifle-carrying rioters. And we must acknowledge how a white man's bad day results in the targeting of Asian-run businesses and the deaths of 6 Asian women. Because when we spent decades covering up for your country's past while spending no time addressing it, it becomes part of that country's present. They say time heals all wounds, but when you don't properly address one, it can fester. Today we see these wounds manifested in the conflicts between white people and people of color, the increased attacks on Asian Americans, as well as the rejuvenated interest in white supremacy groups such as the Proud Boys. And although our former president played a large role in exacerbating these issues, they've always been there. A survey conducted by the PW Research Center in June 2020 explains that 78% of Asian Americans, as well as African Americans, as well as 58% of Hispanics reported they've experienced racial discrimination, with Asians being the most likely to be subjected to racial slurs. And with the history we've made with Kamala Harris as the first elected female and Black vice president, we must not forget that there's much work to be done. We must avoid moving on from issues once we perceive that progress has been made. Like with the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020, when many people simply posted the Black square on Instagram, hashtagging Blackout Tuesday, and calling it enough activism for the day. Because only when we've stopped to acknowledge the festering wounds of systemic racism will we be able to start taking actions to treat it. In the second grade, I moved from a really small town in Kansas to a really racist part of Oklahoma called Oklahoma. Growing up in Oklahoma, I experienced a lot of racial discrimination. And when I tried to tell the adults around me about this issue I was experiencing, they'd often downplay it, saying that racism was prevalent everywhere and that I just needed to wear thicker skin. The same issue occurred when I tried to tell my Asian peers about this problem. They tell me that they experience the same racism as well, but they ignore it and told me that I should too. As a community, Asian Americans have learned to keep their head down and move on when faced with discrimination. According to NBC News, while a quarter of Asian Americans reported that they've experienced racial discrimination, only a quarter responded that they'd be comfortable reporting to law enforcement. And that needs to change. Not only has conforming to the stereotype that we are non-confrontational resulted in us being more easily targeted, but it's our most vulnerable that have targets on their backs. NBC News reports that of the 2,600 hate crimes reported from February 2020 to March 2021, 68% have been women, many being elders. As a community, Asian Americans, we must start speaking up when our friends try to pass off a racist comment as a joke. We need to start speaking up when the boy seated next to us pulls the corners of his eyes back. And we need to start speaking up when our friends and family are being beat on the streets. Because while unlearning the silence that I've been taught has been an uphill battle, the small difference I made when I decided to stop ignoring the racism around me was worth it. What I learned from that was that my journey towards progress will never be over, and that is okay. As a society, let's rewrite our relationship with progress. First, when it comes to issues such as racism, progress will not be linear. Sometimes we will get stuck and fall back. Our journey towards progress is a road full of twists and turns, ups and downs, and that is okay as long as we continue to move forward. What is important is that we acknowledge these issues, don't deny them, instead work the problem. Because denying the problem exists only makes it easier for people to get hurt by them. Second, we must realize that doing one good thing in no way means that we're out of the woods. We're not out of the woods because of the history we made with Kamala Harris, Obama's presidency, or even posting Black square on Instagram. A single moment of success does not mean that the problem is over and that we can simply move on with our lives. Because the truth is, issues as ingrained as racism will never completely disappear, but it's time we accept that. Now, realizing and accepting that our fight against systemic racism might never be over does not mean that things will never get better, but that we must stay vigilant even when things start to look up. We must stop ignoring our problems and instead face them head on. Only then will we truly be able to have progress. Thank you.